Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of this wonderful festival. I'm impressed that so many of you have made it along for this first session. We are going to talk, Hallie and I are going to talk for half an hour or so about her wonderful book, and then there will be a chance for you to ask some questions. So as we're talking, if you want to make little notes of things like you might want to hear more about, and I can come to you at the end of this. As we heard in the introduction, Hallie's book, Story of a Murder, is a kind of revisionist history of one of the most famous crimes of the early part of the last century. It was one of those crimes that was called the crime of the century, very early in the century, and it sort of retained that moniker throughout the century. It's the story of Dr. Crippen, but it's actually, as we've heard, it's the story of also many other people. And in Hallie's previous book about Jack the Ripper and the women that more importantly, the women that Jack the Ripper murdered, she brought to life the lives of those women in incredibly vivid and moving and emotional and human kind of ways, and completely rewrote that history, which we sort of has been told by men mostly, and you know, it's a whole new way of looking at that story. And I think this book, I don't think you probably don't see it as a sequel to that book, but it's continuing that process, certainly.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this was it was very hard to find a book to write after The Five, which had really changed in a lot of people's perception how we think of the murders of Jack the Ripper and how we think of true crime, and because of that, you know, because I told just the women's stories, who were these women, and excluded Jack the Ripper from his own story, and that was quite a kind of, well, revisionist and a revolutionary act in itself, and I wanted to continue to look at these themes. And I realized once I had seen how Jack the Ripper, this Jack the Ripper legend was portrayed, you could see in so many historical murder stories how things had been legendized, how we take stories, we take essentially what is history, and we just take the headlines, the sensationalist headlines. We never question these headlines. We never ask what lies below the surface. We never ask what type of prejudices and preconceived notions from another time we're just parroting. So I thought, you know, with this other book, I wanted to continue an examination of those themes and really look at another crime. I mean, this wasn't that far along from the Jack the Ripper murder, and see how that story has been told, and to unravel it, and to tell it more broadly in a kind of panoramic story in the round.
I guess it would be useful for people who don't know the details of the story itself, for maybe Hallie just to set out. There's essentially 3 major characters in the story, or the direct story of the murder. But maybe useful just to tell a little bit about their history and how it all happened.
Well, it is. There's a trio at the center of this, and there are a lot of other supporting characters. I think it's important first for me to kind of set out what my mission was. The reason why the book is called Story of a Murder is because it looks at a murder not just as something that happens between a victim and a killer, or something that happens between an inspector and the person who arrests, who is the perpetrator. It is a much bigger story. A murder story is something that happens to a family, to a community, to friends, to work colleagues, to a society, and sometimes to a culture, and sometimes leaves a mark in history, which this does as well. So, you know, so I'm telling the story I'm painting a very broad and panoramic picture. However, these 3 characters at the center, Dr. Crippen, Hawley Harvey Crippen, and he and his wife, Belle Elmore, were both Americans at a time when, you know, America was just, the United States was emerging as a kind of superpower, and you could be whoever you wanted to be. You could remake yourself, which is what Crippen did. He trained as a doctor. He then went into homeopathy, which was very popular at the time, but was, you know, still on the fringes of respectability. He had a first wife who died under very mysterious circumstances, and she was Irish, and she died in Salt Lake City. And then he moved immediately to Brooklyn, and he married Belle Elmore, who was much younger than him. And she was a music hall performer, and she had come from the slums of Brooklyn, and she was a woman with a lot of self-determination. I hate to say this, a woman ahead of her time. That's such a cliche, but she really was. She was an incredibly strong character. And then the third person in all of this is Ethel Leneve, who is the English mistress. Crippen and Belle moved to London in the 1890s, and she decided she would become. She trained as an opera singer, and she would become a music hall performer. And Crippen opened an office in London, and Ethel was his, as they called them at the time, lady typist. So she was a young woman who had learned typing and shorthand, and became his right-hand woman, and they had a love affair. And eventually it was decided that, I think by Ethel, almost more than Crippen, that they had to get rid of Belle. And so she was got rid of.
And I guess it captured, certain murders, I guess, cut through, or certain crimes cut through to become emblematic of other things almost immediately, really. They're the sort of the ways that we kind of make sense of what's going on in our society. And this was certainly one of those. George Orwell famously wrote an essay about English murder, in which he referenced this murder as the kind of archetypal murder. It's something that men, usually men and women, would have a Sunday lunch. They'd sit down with a newspaper after lunch, and they'd read about some gruesome crime. And it helped that it was in a sort of middle-class milieu, and it helped that there was a poisoner involved. But almost immediately, in the beginning of that story, Belle became almost demonized more than Crippen, or as much as Crippen. So she became, because she was a strong-willed woman, as you said, a woman ahead of her time, and the suffragette movement was going on and so on, she almost became the demon in this story, which is extraordinary.
She was victim blamed for her own murder. And that is part of the legacy of this. When I talk about how we talk about crimes, how we frame crimes, especially historic true crime, this is why we have to be extremely careful where we get these ideas. So what ends up happening is Belle is poisoned, and eventually Crippen comes to trial. There's much more to it than this, which we will probably talk about. But the aftermath of this is the story of. This is why it is a story of a murder, because the story of how it was then told over the decades. There was a man who wrote an introduction to the trial transcripts called Alexander Bell Filson Young, and he had decided very early on that the love between Crippen and Ethel, although it was, a love affair, it was an illicit love affair, was much more worthy and beautiful than the love he had for his wife. So, he then had to construct a whole story where these were two innocent people who were, caught up in this terrible thing, and Crippen did what he had to do, and, under duress, because his wife was such a terrible, monstrous, horrific aberration of a woman. She was a henpecker, she was shrewish, she was an alcoholic, she was sexually unfaithful. And they had to kill her. And so he wrote this introduction to these trial transcripts. So what then happens, this was in 1920, so every single time somebody writes about the Crippen murder, they reference Alexander Bell Filson Young. And so it's the story of this monstrous Belle Elmore that is kind of set in stone. And I went back and I looked, and there's absolutely no evidence at all she was any of these things that he called her. But he was writing this at a time in 1920 when women were experiencing more freedom than they had ever had. And this idea of this liberated woman, a woman who stood up and spoke, a woman who stood on stage and sang, a woman who reinvented herself, was threatening and terrifying to the order. And so, of course, she had to be framed in this way.
And as you set out in the book, and I think there's still some, this debate in some extreme circles that question even whether Crippen was guilty of the crime. I think you prove pretty incontrovertibly that he did this, but also within those circles, there's this sort of refusal to accept that this wonderful woman kind of could exist at this moment, really. That these musical ladies, and there's a wonderful group of them in the book who start to investigate Belle's disappearance, but that they could exist at this moment, and that they could have a voice, and that they could be there.
It's a really interesting time, because the people who actually raised the alarm about this would have gone under the radar if it wasn't for this group that Belle was the treasurer of, and this group was called the Music Hall Ladies Guild, and they were a kind of proto-union, and they were also a social organization and a charity. And it was a group of women who worked in the music hall, and they raised money for impoverished women and children who also worked in the music hall. So every year they would have fundraisers, they would give money out, and Belle raised an enormous amount of money. She was extremely active in this charity, and she was extremely well loved. And of course, the theory was, oh, nobody liked her, nobody would miss her if she was gone. It was completely untrue, because these women, when she disappeared, Crippen said his excuse was, well, she's gone to America to go visit a sick relative. And in fact, he had poisoned her and chopped up her body and put it under the brickwork of the cellar. And these women were not buying this story at all. And they started their own investigation. They got a private investigator involved. They went to Scotland Yard. They went to Scotland Yard numerous times, but Scotland Yard at first dismissed them because they were bohemian ladies. And well, these sorts of things happen. Perfectly good explanations for why a wife would run off. So they never bothered actually really investigating it. So the women themselves took it on themselves, and they went round to the house, and they were knocking on doors, and they got a private investigator to tail Crippen and Ethel. And then finally, a man, one of their husbands, went to Scotland Yard and said, look, this has really become a problem. We need to know where she is. She's disappeared. And it was only then when Chief Inspector Walter Dew of Scotland Yard started to investigate. And even then, he was very slow to his feet. He took about a week to get around to interviewing various people, and thought, well, maybe there might be something in this. Maybe the woman didn't go to America.
There was this immediate tendency, which has, as you say, has carried on through the century, essentially, of tending to believe the man, tending to believe that he couldn't have done this thing, that he appeared to be a respectable man on the surface. He lived in a sort of 10-bedroom, semi-detached house, and
he was mild-mannered.
He trained as a doctor, and you dismantle that really piece by piece. And I guess it was dismantled a little bit at the time, but it's never been fully dismantled.
Well, I've tried to do this because the whole idea was, even at first, even the Music Hall Ladies Guild, these people were quite incredulous. Crippen was, he is described as a small, mild-mannered man. Well, I think today we've become much more cynical and much more able to cite a kind of fraudster and a charlatan. And that is precisely what he was. He was a confidence trickster. He was very diminutive, and he was very self-effacing, and he was very polite. And so people trusted him. But he used this as a front to perpetrate a number of frauds. He was a very, very skilled conman and a fraudster. And so, under this guise, history has kind of remembered him as this meek man. The interesting thing about this is that this narrative, what I mentioned before about the demonization of Belle Elmore and the way in which Alexander Bell Filson Young told this story initially, has carried on to such a degree, and Belle, as the decades go by, was more and more demonized, so that in 2007, this is remarkable, there was a documentary that was made that was shown in the US and the UK, which purported to prove his innocence, because there was a man at the center of this who was a He's a poisons expert in Chicago who was so caught up in the narrative of Crippen being innocent and Belle being monstrous Belle that he arranged to have, there was a skin sample that still is in the Royal Hospital collection that was used in the trial. And he had the DNA tested by a lab in Chicago. And lo and behold, it turns out it wasn't Belle Elmore's DNA and it was a man. Therefore, Crippen was innocent, but the murderer becomes the victim because she didn't come forward to stop his execution. And the victim, the victim becomes the murderer and the murderer becomes the victim. However, I can say that I have had Professor Turi King in the UK, who is a DNA expert, who helped to identify the remains of Richard III. And she had a look at the white paper and she said, this is bogus. She said it was, and first of all, there would be male DNA all over this skin sample anyway, because it was touched by everyone. So anyway, I was going to say, case is closed. Case has always been closed. He was always the murderer, but there is such a determination to see him as an innocent person that they would go to that lane.
And one of the things that story makes clear, I mean, and this was almost the archetype of that originally, was that crimes become a sort of arena for culture wars, really. That people take sides and they choose a partner. And this was the kind of the perfect sort of scenario for that. And it's continued. I mean, it's chilling, really, to read that stuff coming up to the present day, that people are still demonizing this woman.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, you obviously had history of this with the book, The Five, where you had a lot of kind of backlash from so-called ripperologists.
Yes, I did.
Who,
I did.
Sort of are obsessed with that crime and hated the way that you had rewritten it and reinvented it. What was that like to...
It was really, I mean, it wasn't, unless you've gone through it, it's very hard to describe to what it's like to be trolled, even stalked, digitally stalked for about 6 or 7 years. And I mean, at first it was very bad. And I realized that what I had done, it wasn't about the victims themselves. It was about a load of people with egos who had been told that what they had always believed was actually wrong. And these are, and mostly men and some women, who have very dull jobs and very dull lives, and they have immersed themselves in trying to solve this question of who Jack the Ripper is. And they have learned everything they can possibly learn. They've read each other's self-published books. They've self-published books with their theories in it. And here comes this woman, me, from outside, basically saying, well, actually, this is wrong. Have you ever thought of it in this way? And it was so shocking to them because it was a direct assault on their egos.
Did you imagine that was going to happen? Did you have any idea that was going to happen?
I just can't, and I've seen this with other things as well, that people personalize things. And again, culture wars, historical revisionism is, people throw around the word historical revisionism all the time. This is a case of historical revisionism, but I might add, and this is a very important thing to add, as historians, our job is to revise history. Our job is to completely re-examine. And there is a real misconception about what history is, what historians do. We don't just read books and regurgitate so-called facts. We create arguments. And it sounds kind of strange to say that history isn't about facts. History is about an argument built around what we know, and sometimes those facts are deconstructed and other arguments are built. So I think this is the problem with the culture wars, is this idea that you're distorting the facts, you're rewriting history. History is meant to be rewritten. It's not fixed.
And did you, obviously the book is incredibly deeply researched. It's almost every page you're thinking, how did Hallie find that out? Slightly, I also realized that you researched most of it during COVID, or some of it, so that must have been very difficult. But I mean, one of the advantages of obviously of looking at a trial and a crime is that there's lots of court documents and so on. But you also went back to families. Can you just talk a bit about the process of you finding out this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, you mentioned COVID, and that was, I'm sure there are a number of writers in the audience as well. It was a really tricky time to do any sort of research whatsoever, because around the world, archives and libraries were shut. And so I had started this book, I had signed the contract, and then we went into lockdown. And then sporadically the archives would open and I'd have to run in and do, sometimes they'd let you in for 4 hours and I'd have to photograph everything. And then I would come home and I'd look at things and realize that it was all out of sequence. And then I'd have to wait 6 months to go back and do the rest of the research. So that was extremely challenging. But what I like to do when I do my research, and I try to be extremely thorough, because one of the problems is when you're telling a story, is it's like layers of an onion. And there's, especially with true crime, historical true crime, or any historical event, you have to pull back the first layer, which is, it's the kind of rarefication of what happened. And often the rarefication of what happened as it's passed from one person to one newspaper to one book to another book loses something. So you have to go all the way back and see what was originally there in the first place. So I go back to the documents, and there were lots of trial transcripts. But what is most interesting about working with this material, and as a historian, actually crime is so rich because a murder throws up an enormous amount of paperwork. A murder creates witness statements, police statements, all sorts of inventories, all sorts of things like that give us such a rich and textured snapshot of a single moment in time. What people were doing, what people were thinking, what they were eating, what they were wearing, what their daily lives were like, their turns of phrase, how they used language, all of these things. And suddenly we have all of this in all these different voices from people who had never normally have made it into the historical record. And so I wanted to bring out the richness of that and use all of these voices, because history is a chorus. There are always other people in the room. It is never one person's story.
And were there sort of eureka moments in that process? Were there moments where you actually felt, yes, I understand who Belle is. I can now see what Crippen. I mean, you go back to the previous generation. His first marriage, which ended in incredibly suspicious circumstances. His wife died when she was 33. Slightly unexplained circumstances. But all of that feeds this pattern of behavior, but also this wider social milieu. But were there moments where you thought, wow, this is becoming all clear to me?
Yeah, I mean, the clarity of it, it's just, for me, it's reading this documentation in other people's voices, the first-hand accounts, and I can't tell you how gripping it is, what it's like and I'm sure there are historians out here who have dealt with, original documents, and you sit down in the archive, and here is this person literally telling you their story and you're just there. There's almost no boundary between you and the past. You can touch that person, and that is quite an amazing experience.
And is there a kind of emotional trauma involved in that as well? I mean, I imagine, particularly with your previous book, where you were uncovering some incredibly traumatic things.
Yeah.
How emotionally taxing is it?
It's funny. I mean, with all of these things, these two books that I've written have, a very, very traumatic thing at the beginning. In the 5, I completely excluded the murders of these 5 women, because I think we all know that story. We know how they were murdered. We don't need to go into that again. I wanted to tell a life story. However, when I started investigating, when I started reading about that crime and about Belle's death, there is that very gruesome thing that you have to familiarize yourself with, which is what happened to them. How were they killed? And that, at first, my gut instinct is, God, this is horrible. This is a horrible, horrible thing, and I have nightmares. And then, in a strange way, that sort of burns it off. It burns off the horror. And then I can be incredibly clinical and detached in a very scientific way from that experience. And so, for example, I'm very careful. I don't like to glorify the actual murder of human beings, because I know some people do, and that's part of the way in which they tell these stories, but I'm very uncomfortable with that. So in this case, I felt, however, with Story of a Murder, it was really important to talk about how Belle was murdered, because it's why this was considered a crime, such a heinous crime, because it was what a husband had done to a wife. And there was so little mercy. He poisoned her, but then he cut her body into very small pieces. He removed the bones, he removed the head, he disposed of these bit by bit, and then tried to get rid of the last, last bits of skin and viscera by burying it under the brickwork and putting quicklime on it. And unfortunately, what he didn't realize is when quicklime is exposed to water, it becomes a preservative. And so that when the police went digging, they found the remains, otherwise would have disintegrated. But the point about that was, I felt it was really important to introduce this for a couple of reasons, because we had to know why the crime was considered so heinous, what he actually did to his wife's body. But also there is this fascinating moment, there is this switch in the way we remember Belle Elmore. She was a person, and then suddenly in the newspapers, she is described in scientific terms completely dehumanized. The human is gone. She is simply a liver. She's simply part of a stomach. She is a hair curler. She is a clump of hair. She is a piece of skin. She's not a human being. And I felt it was so important for us to keep tethered that every human being, no matter what state they are in, is always a human being.
And you get the sense, obviously, I mean, true crime as a genre kind of dominates our publishing world. It dominates our TV screens. There's a massive appetite for it, but too often and so often, that human story that precedes this horrific event and the human person that's destroyed by this horrific event is not part of that story. We still focus so much on the perpetrators.
Yeah, I think we do, and we oversimplify. And again, one of the things that because this is a story of a murder and it is a panoramic telling, not just cradle to grave of the murderer or the victim, but the entire process of the plotting of the murder to the committing of the murder to the flight, and the two of them flee. Ethel and Crippen flee dressed as father and son. It's very, very famous. This is what the crime is remembered for. But to the capture, and then to the processing of him and Ethel through the justice system. Because we are obsessed with detective stories, we're obsessed with this, the kind of the cop getting the perpetrator. And the story often ends there on TV or in books. But that isn't even the big, he's, in theory, in the real world, you've arrested somebody, they still have to be pushed through the filter of justice to actually be found guilty. So just because you've amassed a lot of evidence doesn't mean they're going to be found guilty in court. So I wanted to take everyone through the procedures of the court and how it works, and also the biases of the jury. And the biases of the jury, today we have everybody's biased. Everybody brings in their thoughts into, the jury room when they're discussing all of this. And it was no different in 1910 when it was an all-male jury who would have looked kindly on Crippen, but in fact actually found him guilty within 30 minutes. But they did bring a lot of prejudices, and the barristers played on those prejudices, and that is a very interesting thing to see, because that influences so much, even today, the outcome of trials.
And we want that, as you say, the real life is obviously very messy, and we want that, certainly in crime fiction, there's that neatness, really. And I know Conan Doyle was at the trial, and Agatha Christie was obsessed with the story in some ways. How much has fiction kind of ruined our sense of what crime actually is and the horror of it, do you think?
I think fiction has made, I think people read crime fiction for a number of reasons. They read it because it's a great puzzle. It's a fast-moving story. And we've always been interested in these things. It's a mystery in many ways that you're having to solve, and you engage your brain in that. But I think with a lot of crime, we lose a sense of reality. We lose our sense of understanding of what it is and the true horror of this. And as I describe, a murder is something which I describe in the book. It's like an explosion, and all of these people in proximity to the victim, whether that's a family member, whether it's a work colleague, a friend, a neighbor, somebody like that, who will be hit by the shrapnel of this impact. And those people's stories are part of a story of a murder too.
I mean, we're getting close to the end of our time, but the extraordinary person, the person who sort of escapes almost unscathed from this story is Ethel, who was the...
Yes.
And I was astonished to discover that she lived a kind of full... She originally sort of exploited it and sold her story, but then lived a sort of separate life, got married, had kids, and her kids didn't even know that she was part of this.
Complete anonymity. It is really, really incredible. And she died in 1967. And, and what a life, and lived with this story, and also lived knowing she had participated in this murder and was acquitted, and had a series of nervous breakdowns throughout her life. And I think that is amazing. That haunted me. What would it have been like to know you had been acquitted of a murder and to have to live the rest of your life in silence and to never actually use your name because your name was so infamous? She was considered one of the most scarlet women in the world at that time.
And to live to the 60s, it's just brings it right up to...
Into the 1960s.
I know. I think... thank you, Hallie. That's lovely. We can take some questions. If there's some questions, we can carry on talking if there are questions. But if there are questions from the floor, there's a lady here in the purple top and glasses, just straight at the back there, 3 rows from the back. Have we got a microphone? Not sure we've got a microphone.
Do we have a microphone?
Hold on, it's coming.
Microphone's coming.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Meg from Brisbane, Australia. Thank you for such a fascinating session. Ethical true crime is my favourite way to understand history. I wondered if you can unpack a little further why ethical true crime gives us such engaging and rich access to history, particularly of lesser heard voices.
Because in the documentation surrounding the crime, so all of the interviews, we are hearing ordinary people's voices because they're the witnesses. They're the people who, who are interviewed by the police, and the police give their stories. And the ordinary policeman is a voice you don't necessarily hear either. And they're just talking about what their daily lives were like and who they were and what their perceptions were. And so it makes it so much more accessible. And I like to say that a crime creates a snapshot, or it can be used as a core section for understanding history. You literally, it's that moment frozen in time. Let's look at all of these people on this particular week, what they were doing, what they were thinking, what they were saying, and examine it. And that gives you a flavor of what, say, in this example, the late Edwardian mind was like.
And as you were saying, this snapshot occurred at the moment as the crime happened. It was the first time that telegraphic communication was used.
Yeah.
And so that was a part of it. And there's also the fact that Freud's ideas were just bubbling under the... Psychoanalysis was bubbling under the surface.
Yeah, it was it was called the crime of the century because there was a journalist from the Boston Globe who was writing the story and proclaimed it the crime of the century because he had no idea what was coming in the 20th century. But he said, isn't this amazing? This man was caught when Crippen was fleeing on the Montrose. The Marconi wireless device managed to catch him by they wired the story to land, and then Inspector Dew got on a faster ship and got to Quebec and was able to arrest him. And isn't it remarkable we live in a time of wireless technology, of super fast ships, of psychoanalysis, so we can understand the criminal mind. This was an incredible time. The turn of the century, I think it's comparable to our own time in terms of this rapid change. You had in a handful of years the invention And the complete, takeover of earlier technology of horse and carriage, of the automobile, of flight, motion picture, X-ray, all of these things were happening at the same time. And it was thrilling and a little bit terrifying for people. And then, 4 years later, at the start of the First World War, suddenly everybody sees what this technology can do, wholesale killing. And then suddenly there's a kind of screeching of brakes and people are reassessing this.
There's a great moment in the book where you sort of say people saw it as almost a premonition of the century to come, really.
Yeah,
it was like a new way of death somehow. There's a lady right at the back there with her hands up with a yellow scarf on.
Good morning, Hallie. This is Kim.
Oh.
Hi. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you first got interested in true crime. And also, if you could tell us a little bit more about this fascinating thought of how a murder is not just a moment in time, but also a mirror of the society in which it happens. And perhaps you could expand a little bit on whether you think that's sort of universal or just particular to the crimes that you are looking at in Britain.
I think it's completely universal. It is, first of all, because the documentation, whether it happened last week or whether it happened 150 years ago, you have all of these people focusing and writing about that moment and what was going on. And so that stands as a historical record. And that's why, that applies for everything, whether it was a crime that happened last week or, centuries ago. And that actually is the very reason why I became interested in true crime, because as a historian, it's so rich. There's so much there to unpack. And as a social historian, what I am interested in is what is going on under the surface of the world. I am not so interested in the banner headlines of history. I mean, yes, wars and statecraft and all that is interesting, but I'm very, very interested in the human beings who inhabited a particular era and the way in which you can access these stories. I mean, this rich seam of information, which are witness statements and trial transcripts. It is remarkable.
There's a gentleman down the front here. Yeah. You? Yes, with the glasses on. Yeah.
Hi, Hallie. This is Anupam from Mumbai. Thanks for the fascinating session. I'm wondering what writing a book like this does to the author, yourself, through the process, and by the end of it, what kind of a relationship you end up building with the victim whose story you are telling, the truth that you're trying to uncover, and how do you look at your purpose in life, in your work, in the art, while you're doing this? Does it change the way you look at what you're doing in life, and how does it change you? Like, was the Hallie who started the book different from the one who ended it?
Yeah, well, I think that had more to do with the fact I had to write it during lockdown. And yes, I had to learn to be very patient. But your point is, I think there is something, history can be a very meditative art in many ways, because you sit for a long time contemplating events, and your mind, I'd like to describe, I have developed the historian's eye. I have two sets of eyes. I have eyes that look at the here and now, at the immediate, and then eyes that look forward and backward, because I realize wherever we are, we're just living through a revolution of the wheel. There were always times of calamity, and there were always times that were better, and progress is not linear. And I think it has made me, I don't want to say detached, but perhaps able to understand the turmoil of our world with a little bit more complexity and nuance. And I think, than I was before. And that and being entrenching yourself in history, immersing yourself in history is a way in which you can do that, because you rise above yourself, your current concerns, your world. You can reflect on how good do we have it? How bad do we have it? Is it likely to get better? Is it likely to get worse? And the answer is probably, to both of those last questions, yes. Because it has got better and has always got worse. So maybe we just need to be in our present time.
We've got time for one more question, I think. Lady down at the front here in the yellow. Mike Spencer.
Thank you. Fascinating. What can you tell us about this jury? And did you have records of the vetting of this jury and who they were and what they said? And was there a clue during the vetting that they were as impartial as they obviously were?
Well, I don't think they were necessarily impartial. At the time, you had to be a man and you had to be a property owner. And that was it. I mean, in Britain, that is a certain class of people, a person who is a professional man or, a man who owns property, who has a certain amount of money. Well, they came with their own set of prejudices. Women belonged in the home. They were conservative in their outlook. They had prejudices against foreigners. It's very interesting, a lot of things that were said that were very, they were playing up on the fact that Belle's background was Polish, and they were trying to kind of say, well, she was kind of morally corrupt because she's basically a Polish peasant. And, that played on Polonophobia at the time. It played on, the kind of hatred of women, the dislike of Americans, the strangeness of Americans. So they really leaned into that. And the jury, however, the jury still managed to find Crippen guilty. They did, however, acquit Ethel because she was conceptualized as this innocent woman, this girl, although she was 27 and she was not innocent. And she simply didn't know any better. And so, by playing into the prejudices that the jury had about women, about innocent-looking women, they were able to get her off.
Thank you, Hallie. It's been a pleasure sitting up here talking to you. We all need to develop those two sets of eyes, obviously, and this book is a wonderful argument for nuance, and at a time when nuance is in short supply, whether it's about history or about current affairs. So I urge you all to read it. I think Hallie is going to be signing over there in a little bit. So please go and buy her book, and you'll get as much out of it as I did. Thank you.
Thank you, Hallie, for that new set of eyes. Hallie Rubenhold and Tim Adams.